Privilege to have Michal Cotler-Wunsh here with us. Michal served in the Knesset as a member of the Knesset, has an amazing career. You can read her biography. I won't reread it to you. It's in the book. Please look at it. Michal's currently the special envoy on issues of anti-Semitism for the Israeli government. Today she's going to be speaking about the hijacking and weaponizing of law to in the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism and terror. So really it's a privilege that you're here, and thanks for being here.
Thank
Michal.
you. Thank you. I'm going to stand. I'm a pacer. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Am I ruining anything?
No,
Okay.
feel free.
Is that okay? Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm indeed Michal Cotler-Wunsh, Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. I was appointed to this role 3 weeks before October the 7th. I have counterparts in about 35 different countries, the United States, Canada, many European countries. Special Envoys for Combating Anti-Semitism. It's actually one of the most devastating roles to be appointed to. Somebody wrote me when I was appointed, congratulations and condolences. And that was, as I said, just 3 weeks before October the 7th. And I'll say Israel, and we'll maybe delve into this a little bit more and what that means. Israel actually traditionally didn't have this role, the Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. I'm Israel's second Special Envoy. At the moment, Israel still does not have the infrastructure that would be required for a Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism anywhere in the world to actually be able to do this role. I currently serve in this role, having been appointed by the Foreign Ministry in a voluntary capacity. It tells you more or less everything that you need to know about the lack of understanding internally too, that what we are seeing, not just in the tsunami of anti-Semitism, but I'll say in its normalization, as the title of my talk refers to, is just a manifestation of what is a raging war. And I will say, I would term this as the 8th front of a raging war of barbarism on civilization, an 8th front that in many, many ways has been exposed in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, and what very rarely gets reported in mainstream media, not just October the 7th, this ongoing war since October the 7th. In the language of law, thousands of rockets, missiles, UAVs that were fired indiscriminately at Israelis on and since October the 7th, unreported. Each one of them, thousands of them, a double war crime in the language of the law, targeting civilians from densely populated civilian areas, all of them unreported in the annals of history. None of them actually condemned by the institutions, the mechanisms, the agencies, the organizations created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect international law, this rules-based order, and ensure that it is upheld, promoted, and protected equally and consistently. Not because I'm a lawyer, but because we understand that if any rule is applied selectively, any principle applied selectively, if there are double standards in the application of any principle, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. So what I would like to do, and what I've done in the past 22 months in this role, traveling essentially from just about a week after October the 7th, where I left our best friend's son's Shiva to get on my first flight to travel around the world. He was killed, our Yaziri, on October the 7th, running down to the south. He never made it to synagogue that morning, Simchat Torah, as so many others were killed on and since that day on the front lines of this raging war of barbarism and civilization. And what I have realized, I actually just said to the previous group, that is the hardest thing to do is you hear in my voice's urgency. What I have tried to do is actually sound sirens around the world, everywhere that I land. Now, when those sirens were sounding in Israel several times a day and night, then I was able to say to most Israelis, there are sirens sounding, we can hear them, but abroad, in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, nobody can hear the sirens, though they should be audible to them too. But because what October the 7th was the attack of barbarism on civilization, but what the responses to October the 7th have been of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew, of denial, for that began on October the 7th, even while its barbaric perpetrators were live streaming war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of justification, Judith Butler, who I studied in law school, explaining that rape is armed resistance. And of the attack of Jews and Zionists, because you need not be a Jew to be the target of this strain of anti-Semitism and ever-mutating virus. You need just believe in Israel's right to exist, or be identified as, or self-identify as a Zionist to be the target of anti-Zionism, the new strain of anti-Semitism, and therefore be attacked on the streets of Canada, Australia, Germany, France, the United States of America, where 2 Israeli diplomats were gunned down in cold blood, Yaron and Sarah, outside of a Jewish museum at the end of a Jewish organization event that was intent to speak about pathways to peace. And the earth didn't shake at Sarah and Yaron's funerals, and flags were not lowered to half-mast. And so how have we arrived at this moment that the responses to October the 7th and the war that it launched intent to annihilate the state of Israel, openly declaring so in the charter of Hamas, but one proxy of the genocidal Islamic regime in Iran, alongside the Houthis and Hezbollah and Iran itself? How can it be that 22 months of what I would call an 8th front of war has been raging? What has it exposed in the responses to the October 7th massacre and the war that it waged? And I would like to be able to share with you from that perspective why it is critical that we understand that the hijacking and inversion and weaponization of international law and its institutions, and its principles, and its agencies, created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect, actually renders this not just an existential moment for the state of Israel, the Jew among nations, the nation-state of the Jewish people, a prototypical indigenous people, indigeneity, another word that was hijacked, appropriated, redefined, and weaponized. Indigeneity has meaning. A people that speak the same language, Hebrew, that traverse the same land, Israel, that practice the same customs and rituals, that hearken to the same God and prophets for thousands of years. It's literally the meaning of indigeneity. The return of an indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution, committed to equality. That's just Israel's Declaration of Independence. That's not me. And the 3 pillars, if you will, of that Declaration of Independence: Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, to which we returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution as a prototypical indigenous people. The word didn't exist yet, but Ben-Gurion explains precisely, describes what an indigenous people are, committed to equality. The understanding that that too has been hijacked and appropriated in this multi-front war, openly declaring intent to annihilate the state of Israel, the Jew among nations, but not just that. Because in doing so, the tsunami of anti-Semitism, and I'll say much worse than what we saw in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, the normalization of anti-Semitism, that I described some of the examples of, including Yaron and Sarah, and many, many others, including a soldier, an IDF soldier in his home in the United States, where death to the IDF is spray painted outside his home, and his cars, or his family's cars, set on fire. And of course around the world, in Sydney, in London, where what we see in protests mislabeled as pro-Palestinian, they're not pro-Palestinian. They're pro-Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, still listed as such in the UK, though there are already efforts to undesignate Hamas a genocidal terror organization right here in the UK as well. They are pro the Islamic Republic of Iran. You don't have to believe me. Just look at the signs that are being carried across the bridge in Sydney, or right here in London, or in Toronto, with the butcher of Tehran, the supreme butcher of Tehran, if you will, as the right side of history, right here in the streets of London days after VE Day, the right side of history, that's not a pro-Palestinian. If you're pro-Palestinian, you would be protesting to free Gaza from Hamas, to free Lebanon from Hezbollah, to free Yemen from the Houthis, to free the people of Iran, most betrayed by the West in the last decades, from the criminal Islamic regime in Iran. So when we mislabel those protests with hundreds of thousands, mobs, walking through streets as pro-Palestinian, we have actually accepted the rhetoric that says, this is not actually a legitimate attack on, or perceived as legitimate attack of barbarism on civilization. This is something else. This is acceptable, justified resistance to what has been mislabeled as European colonialism. I'm not a European colonialist, neither is the State of Israel. To genocide that has been appropriated and weaponized after its redefinition, to starvation, to the terminology that we know have meaning. And I would like to be able to posit here that after the return of that prototypical indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution, where we were committed to equality, Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948, a series of conventional wars were waged, openly declaring their intent to wipe Israel off the map for a Judenrein world. And they failed. But in 1975, we're about to mark 50 years to what I will call the unconventional war for public opinion. The unconventional war for hearts and minds that began with blood libel number 1 of Zionism as racism. Passed in the UN as a resolution that if you understand and listen to the then US Ambassador to the UN, Patrick Moynihan, who understands, well, he understands two things. One, that Zionism can't be racism. That's literally the adoption of Nazi ideology because we are not a race. We are a people. And two, that it was in international institutions and principles and law that will be hijacked to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the State of Israel, alleging that Zionism is racism, knowing that the decision was that Nazism is racism, and therefore, not many years will pass before Zionism will be equated with Nazism. Welcome to 2025. 50 years later, blood libel number 1, Zionism is racism, the opening shot of an unconventional war for public opinion. 50 years is what it took for Soviet propaganda, already pre-existing 1975, by the way, to take hold and be peddled in the name of progress on every campus, on social media, on streets, on legacy media, across spaces and places. Zionism is racism, blood libel number 1, is the first stop in the analysis of the hijacking and weaponization of international law and its institutions and its agencies and its principles that we are witnessing today. Blood libel number 2, Israel is an apartheid state. The 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, in which the next step that we saw, not just the international law institutions, official institutions, if you will, the UN, its agencies, but the human rights infrastructure created to ensure this international rules-based order is upheld, promoted, and protected equally and consistently, applied to all. A human rights infrastructure that includes Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and an entire NGO industry that on the last day of the 2001 UN Durban Conference Against Racism becomes an anti-Semitic hate fest, exposing the NGO infrastructure that will then continue to peddle blood libel number 2, Israel is an apartheid state. Now, I'm old enough to remember precisely what apartheid was. And Israel is as imperfect as all other democracies are. But Israel is not an apartheid state. And what you've done by appropriating not only racism, equating it with Zionism, but appropriating now apartheid, equating it with Israel, is actually minimize what racism was and is, what apartheid was, and in places where there is gender apartheid like Iran is, and the appropriation and weaponization of the international institutions, its mechanisms, its principles continues, with the most Orwellian inverted example in the aftermath of the October 7 massacre, with accusing the state of Israel, seating it on the dock of the accused, if you will, Dreyfus, appropriating the term genocide that Raphael Lemkin coined, whose entire family was annihilated in Auschwitz alongside Lauterbach, who coins crimes against humanity, to describe the atrocities of the Holocaust, as my father taught me, too terrible to imagine but not too terrible to have happened. Genocide appropriated to seat Israel on the dock of the accused in none other than the International Court of Justice, by none other than South Africa, using none other than the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide by South Africa, of which, of course, the State of Israel was one of the first signatories in 1948, that anchors the commitment of never again to anyone, using that convention to seat Israel on the dock of the accused, even as it defends itself from openly declared genocidal intent in the aftermath of war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated on and since October the 7th, having to defend itself from the dock of the accused Dreyfus of the time, demonized, delegitimized, and applied double standards to in what was supposed to be a court of last resort. Hijacked and weaponized. Now, when we describe the understanding of these international institutions that were created and entrusted so that never again to anyone, never again as that prospective commitment, because we cannot prevent the past. We have to remember the past so that we can identify the threats of the present in order to be able to prevent the recurrence of atrocities in the future. And I say this over and over again, I think it was Mark Twain, yes, history repeats, but not in the exact same way. And we keep looking for it to repeat in the exact same way. It repeats in rhyme. And what anti-Semitism, this ever-mutating lethal virus that has existed for as long as the Jewish people have existed, for thousands of years, and that did not die in Auschwitz, it just mutated to create a new strain that I will call anti-Zionism, the denial of Israel's very right to exist. By the way, it's why you don't need to be a Jew to be the target of this strain of an ever-mutating lethal hate. You just need to be a Zionist, or be identified as a Zionist, or mention that you believe in Israel's right to exist as one single Jewish state, because there are tens of Muslim-majority countries and tens of Christian-majority countries. There should be one Jewish-majority country. If you think that, you are the legitimate target of this viral, ever-mutating, lethal hate. Now, if we want to be able to understand it, it's why ISGAP's work is so critically important. How that virus mutates, as viruses mutate. We all became viral experts post-COVID, right? We understand that when COVID-19 comes around and we can inoculate our society or community or our school against COVID-19, by the time Omicron comes around, it's not so helpful. Viruses create new lethal strains, and unless we can identify all of them comprehensively, and by the way, when the new strain comes along, the old strains, they haven't died. They're not gone. When the new strains come around and we allow them to infect and spread, then the old strains also become emboldened. And so when we have identified this new strain of an ever-mutating lethal hate that uses the mechanism so critical to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and that mechanism that I referred to last year, I spoke here alongside Natan Sharansky, it was my greatest honor. The 3 Ds of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism that Natan added to that IRA working definition are a critical piece, because they are the mechanism to actually make good, if you will, of the pledge of never again. Because as I said, it's not enough to remember the past. For never again to mean anything, we need to understand not just what happened, but how it happens, not never again, again and again. Demonization, delegitimization and the application of double standards are the mechanism, and I'll say they're not just the mechanism for the genocide of the Shoah. They were the mechanism for the brutal murder of 800,000 Tutsis by the Hutus. It didn't happen overnight. Demonization, or dehumanization when it's a person, delegitimization and application of double standards are what enabled to walk past the poster of Fear Bibas and rip it down on the streets of New York City. Because that's not a human baby. And the sign of the lost dog next to it, oh, that's not a problem. But if that's not a human baby, and that baby has no right to exist, and my baby's not like that baby, then demonization, delegitimization, application of double standards are the mechanism that normalize anti-Semitism as this ever-mutating lethal hate again and again, but also enable the crimes against humanity and the genocide of tyrant, terror, radical entities that in the meantime have taken our eye off the ball. And there's nothing about what's happening in Sudan, and nothing about the Uyghurs in China. And we wonder, how can that be? It can be because the gravest violators of human rights are seated around the table at the organizations like the UN and the Security Council and the Human Rights Council. The gravest violators of human rights are seated around those tables. China, Cuba, Iran. They're seated around the tables of those entities of the international rules-based order created post-World War II so that never again, we just marked 80 years to the UN. And it is, and I spoke about it 1 month after October the 7th, it is the case that what October the 7th was, as I described it then, was the Kristallnacht moment of our times. And the question was then, and remains, what you do in the aftermath of October the 7th. If what you do in the aftermath is embolden the genocidal terror proxies of an Islamic Republic in Iran to dictate the conduct and the equations for democracies, including in the abduction of 251 human beings that, let's see, are housed, Hamas leadership, by the same Qatar that ISGAP's research will tell us has given billions to American universities and to K-12 curriculum, and also to Al Jazeera, and also to Hamas, and also to the housing of Hamas leaders in the Four Seasons in Doha. But if Qatar is then cast as honest broker in the negotiations, because we're negotiating now with terror, that's what post-October the 7th exposed. At least I remember growing up in the 80s that I thought we don't negotiate with terror. It turns out we do. And Churchill's warning to Chamberlain that we had the choice between dishonor and war, and we chose dishonor and will have war, makes this an existential moment, not just for the state of Israel, the Jew among nations, not at all. And not just to Jews and its supporters around the world. It makes this an existential moment for humanity, for civilization as we know it, with an openly declared intent to build an alternate reality on the rubble of our civilization, right here in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, in countries around Europe, in democracies around the world that have failed to understand that the strengths of democracies have been identified as weaknesses that can collapse us from within. And Israel is just on the front lines. And by the way, it doesn't mean that Israelis all understand what I'm saying now, that Israel is on the front lines of a war of barbarism on our shared civilization. And that does not mean that Israel is perfect. It just means that this is a war on the foundations of democracies as we know them. And it is the law that actually becomes one of the most important tools that can justify, if hijacked and weaponized, the murder of Sarah and Yaron in the name of free Palestine, when all that call is legitimization of the murder of two representatives of the state of Israel outside of a Jewish museum at the end of a Jewish event. the understanding that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition has become not just more accurate, but more urgent to be able to be demanded the implementation of across spaces and places, because more than 40 countries, more than 1,200 entities not only adopted it, recognizing it as the gold standard of what anti-Semitism means, and the understanding that you have to be able to identify all strains, if you will, all 11 examples of what is an ever-mutating lethal hate, to actually combat it. So that the statement by many politicians that we hear daily, there is no room for anti-Semitism in, you fill in the blank, Canada, the United States, Germany. Yes, there is. There is room for anti-Semitism, which is why it's being normalized. There is plenty of room for anti-Semitism, not only in its new modern mutated strain, that only demonizes, delegitimizes, applies double standards to the state of Israel. I have nothing against Jews, it's just Zionists I hate. No, it targets Jews in their home, on the street, in their workplace, proving, if you will, the accuracy of IRA, including its most important example that sets it apart from all the other suggested definitions: demonization, delegitimization, application of double standards of the state of Israel. And I have to say, for those that haven't read IRA, of course, criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitism. We understand, because it's clearly stipulated in IRA, criticism of the state of Israel, like the criticism of any other country, that's just how democracy thrives. What is anti-Semitism is delegitimization, the denial of Israel's very right to exist from the river to the sea, if you will, or as the chants against me on campuses go, we don't want no Jew state, we want all the 48. That is what October the 7th pulled off all the masks on. I remind us, because many seem to have forgotten, October the 7th, including who was attacked on that day along the Gaza border, the most peace-loving communities along the Gaza border, that not only believed in peace but worked towards it daily, including 74-year-old Canadian-Israeli peace activist Vivian Silver, whose remains it took 5 weeks and archaeologists to identify. That wasn't about Judea and Samaria. That's a distraction. We can talk about what the policies of Israel should be, for sure. It was about our very existence. It was about 1948. That's what October the 7th was meant to make very clear, first and foremost, to us. First and foremost, to the understanding that the Jewish nation state, does it have a right to exist, was what was attacked in this 8th front of war that has been raging for decades, and of which anti-Semitism is both tool and symptom. An 8th front that, if we don't understand, needs to be fought with a comprehensive strategy, including with the state of Israel's comprehensive strategy, but I will say, with boots on the ground around the world that recognize that Israel is on the front lines of a war of barbarism versus civilization, but it's just the first course. And that if we choose to appease or choose dishonor, there will be war. Everywhere that we cherish humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference, as the late Rabbi Sachs predicted, with anti-Semitism as just the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference. That is the existential moment that we are in. And so when we, from my perspective, understand the analysis of the importance of law, and I'll share anecdotally, in one of my many trips around the world, I was invited by the German Justice Minister to speak at a conference. It began when the Wannsee conference took place. And I don't know why I didn't remember this fact. Maybe I blotted it out, but when I walked into that museum, recognizing that 15 of the men that sat around the table concocting the final solution, 9 of the 15 men, they were lawyers. More than half held doctorates, by the way, in one thing or another. But 9 were lawyers. The understanding that the law, in and of itself, hijacked and weaponized, becomes a weapon of war. And the lack of understanding that that's the moment that we are in, where international law and its mechanisms, its institutions, I mentioned the ICC, the ICJ, I didn't mention UNRWA yet. UNRWA. UNRWA created in sin. Born in sin. Why born in sin? because double standards work in all kinds of ways. Now, UNRWA is the single refugee agency created for one group of refugees only. There's another agency, the UNHCR, it takes care of all the other refugees in the world. And UNRWA, guess what? Hands down refugee status from generation to generation to generation, fifth and sixth generation refugees, perpetuating a forever war funded by the West, enabling UNRWA curriculum that actually peddles good old protocols of Zionist anti-Semitism and Mein Kampf hate of Jews, indoctrinating children with UNRWA curriculum now, as we speak. Not only the thousands of barbaric savages that infiltrated Israel on October the 7th to murder and butcher and rape and abduct. Not only them, children now, as we speak, actually indoctrinated with UNRWA curriculum funded by democratic countries who actually claim to be committed to combating anti-Semitism that I think, although this may not be true anymore, would never allow that curriculum to be taught in their countries. As I said, I'm not sure if that's true anymore. Because we know that Turkey, too, has actually, in many, many ways, taken a piece of the understanding that you can disseminate or invest in software, exporting imams throughout Europe. Muslim Brotherhood imams that actually peddle the same elders of Zion anti-Semitism in Europe, and in Canada, and in other countries around the world. So we are meeting at a moment where, for me, it is critical that we understand that the hijacking and weaponization of the law and the institutions created and trusted to uphold, promote, and protect the law requires of us not just to remember the past, but to reclaim all that has been hijacked. Reclaiming includes, yes, my identity as a member of an indigenous people, so that when I walk into a room of hundreds of students and I say to them, I hate to break it to you, but that whole thing about Jews being hyper-white right here on this campus, it's an irrelevant social construct applied to my story. I'm a member of an indigenous people. In my case, I'm a granddaughter of one of 850,000 Jews ethnically cleansed from Arab lands in Iran, again in my case from Iraq. That whole story about us being European colonialists is one of the most absurd stories, but it's taken hold because it's anti-Semitism and it's how it works. Anti-Semitism will always be able to create this inverted reality as this irrational hate that hates us for both what we are and what we aren't. Ruthless cosmopolitans and having a state. Capitalists and communists. You go back in history and you understand anti-Semitism in that way, and you begin to see that what it is that we're experiencing now, it's not new at all. We've actually been here before, and so I want to posit two more things before we open up to a conversation. One is that in this eighth front, that requires that we remember the past, reclaim not just our identity, but all that's being hijacked and weaponized, inverted. The meaning of genocide inverted, or redefined, if you will, by Amnesty International on page 101 of hundreds of pages of report, to say, you know that thing about intent in the definition of genocide? We're going to remove intent. No need for intent. That's akin to saying manslaughter and murder, they're the same thing. Forget intent. Mens rea and actus reus for the lawyers among us, doesn't matter. You remove intent from genocide and it means something completely different. Well, that's not only what South Africa did in accusing Israel and the ICJ of genocide, it's literally what Amnesty International did, including the Israeli branch leaving Amnesty for that reason, or not agreeing to sign, and then Amnesty International saying to it, well, you're no longer a part of this organization then. The understanding that we need to be able to reclaim those terms that were created in order to be able to ensure that never again to anyone is also part and parcel of our call to action, reclaiming what has been hijacked. And finally, in many, many ways, for me, I guess it's my sort of antidote to the 3 Ds that are so dangerous. The third R, and that is to renew the covenant. To renew the covenant that we have as a people, yes, The covenant, and this time I actually for the first time understood Rabbi Soloveitchik's differentiation between the covenant of fate and covenant of destiny. The covenant of fate being what always defined us from the outside with hate, reminding us what we are. A people. That's what we are. We have a religion, we have a culture, for the last 77 years, we also have a nation state, but what we are is a people for thousands of years. The understanding that the covenant of fate bound us together over and over again from the outside with hate, over and over throughout history, is not what I'm hoping for now in 2025. For the first time I understood what he meant by the covenant of destiny. The covenant of destiny is one of choice. It requires to opt in, to lean in to this identity, to this belonging as a people. Now that we have a nation state, where we have sovereignty, where we have an IEF, where 45% of us live, with 55% of us living in the rest of the world, with relative safety and security, the ability to have voice, to speak up, to ensure that we enlist the allies that we have to understand that this is about them and not just about us. And when I speak about the renewal of a covenant, it's not just a renewal of covenant for Jews as a people. It's the renewal of a covenant to the spaces and places that we inhabit, to the democracies, to the universal principles in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, to that understanding that there are foundational principles that have allowed our democracies to thrive, but that freedom is not free, that it was never free. And renewing the covenant to that commitment has become that much more important. And finally, if I could say, not only are you each boots on the ground in this, what I regard as an unconventional war for public opinion, in which Israel is just on the front lines of, and in fact, which predicts and is still able to prevent the downfall of democracies. But you're on the front lines of something with a moderate majority that I meet around the world, that understand that something has gone very wrong. And very often what they're missing is what you have. It's knowledge. It's the courage to speak up. And I've discovered that courage is contagious. It's the understanding that there are, in fact, this moderate majority public in many of the countries that I have visited that are silent or silenced. And I understand, by the way, the fear and the hesitation. And if your professor tells you that you're going to fail, then I can also understand why a student may say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'll just write what that professor wants me to write. It's not worth it. But this is a war. And in war, we lose people. We lose social capital. We have buried more of our friends' kids and kids' friends in 22 months than I have even begun to process. In these 22 months, it just happens to be the age that I'm in. So my kids' friends and friends' kids, they're all in the army. And we lose people figuratively or literally, and we lose social capital, figuratively or literally, and we may lose a job, and we may lose a very great academic opportunity. But that doesn't preclude the responsibility of showing up and fighting this war alongside allies. And the understanding, and I'll just end with this, the anecdotal understanding that when I came to my talk at NYU months before October the 7th, and my talk was called Combating Anti-Semitism with Human Rights before October the 7th, and I wasn't in this role, by the way. And on the sidewalk of New York City, in the entrance to NYU, what it said in big pink chalk letters actually rendered my talk unnecessary, because what it said was, to my title, Combating Anti-Semitism with Human Rights, what it said on the sidewalk was, Zionists not welcome. Essentially revealing that anti-Zionism is the new strain of anti-Semitism. The understanding that to cross that threshold, every student that came into the room after the first student handed me a pamphlet about myself, alleging on the map of it, the entire map of Israel, by the way, that the Cotler-Wunsh is a genocidal, ethnic cleansing baby killer. And I looked him in the eye and I said, you should come into my talk, I'm going to address some of these points. To which he said, I'm a Jew. I hate Israel. I wish it would disappear. That was just the first time I heard that statement. And I witnessed that at the front of every SJP protest or every other organization on campus, there will always be a Jewish student that says that. To which I responded, "You're going to be a lawyer?" He said, "Yeah, one more semester, I'm graduating." And I said, "Then you should be able to come into my talk. Surely you will have clients with whom you disagree. You should be able to listen to them. Otherwise, you're going to make a really bad lawyer." He didn't come into my talk. But the students that did come in and pass the threshold, saying Zionists not welcome, one of them shared with me, almost quietly, "You know, I decided to come out." I haven't heard that expression since the 80s, and I said, "Come out." And they said, "As a Zionist, I decided to come out." And that courage and that hope, understanding that there are youngsters in the trenches, we have to be there for them. They are fighting on front lines. Coming out as a Zionist, reclaiming the identity, because I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh, if you will, the relevant loathed pound of flesh in what is an ever-mutating virus that latches onto the guiding social construct of each time religion, science, and now the secular religion of our times, human rights. I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh, because my Zionist identity, it's anchored in thousands of years of longing and prayer and yearning to return to Zion, which Zionism, about a 140-year-old progressive national liberation movement, actually anchored its understanding in the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews who believe in Israel's right to exist. The courage that this generation of students and individuals, of people across spaces and places, academics, actually professional unions, now I already know to tell you, certainly in Canada, it's teachers, elementary school teachers that are now faced with a whole new term. I'm not sure if you've discussed it yet. It's not even hot off the press already. It's deep. The Ontario School Board Association adopting a term called APR, anti-Palestinian racism. The definition, you know, the definition's grown out. The definition of which is essentially Zionism. If you are a Zionist, you are an anti-Palestinian racist, according to the Ontario School Board. Welcome to the new reality of the kids, the parents, the teachers, the principals in schools that share with me this new understanding that their identity, Zionist, is now the target of what is dubbing them, forget Zionism as racism 50 years ago in the UN, Zionist is racist. It's very, very personal. Zionist is anti-Palestinian, racist. And so maybe if I would end on just a hopeful note before we open it up, I will say that that courage that is contagious, that I have witnessed in the 22 months of travel around the world, in this raging war of which anti-Semitism is only a tool and a symptom of, it is a great deal of hope. When I come here knowing that ISGAP does the work that it does, not just to trace and follow the money and understand that it's not random, but the same Qatar that houses those Hamas leaders, that was then, I don't even know to explain this, dubbed as honest broker for the return of 251 human beings, who on October the 8th, that Qatar should have been told by every single democracy in the United States in the lead, now 251 people now, or else. The base, the military base, business, everything else goes out the window. But instead, no, it was cast as honest broker. What did we think would happen? That we continue having 50 human beings languishing in the terror tunnels and dungeons. The understanding that it's not just that Qatar that has actually funneled billions into the university spaces and into the K-12 curriculum and into the understanding that we are going to have to piece this puzzle together and make that available so that those people as boots on the ground with courage have the tools that they need to fight in this war. That is actually what gives me hope. But hope in the sense, and I always quote the late Rabbi Sachs on this, in the sense of the differentiation of the late Rabbi Sachs, because people often say to me, "You're very optimistic for somebody who's combating anti-Semitism." And then I quote Rabbi Sachs, who differentiated between optimism and hope. And he said the following: optimism is the belief that everything's going to be okay. And hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And I remind us that the national anthem of the State of Israel is Hijacking. It is the hope. And so meeting and engaging with you in a space like this, an organization like ISGAP, that I know has been able to not only connect the dots, but provide the tools necessary, the weapons, if you will, necessary in this raging war, that gives me a great deal of hope, reminding us that it requires action and courage. So thank you, and we can open up to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Michal. As always, inspirational and clear. Thank you. Your voice is so important. I see you, Larry. I'll be a moment. I'm going to make some quick comments. No, I have a question. Yeah, thank you. So on the one hand, I agree with you. There's hope. There's always hope. Hatikva is Hatikva. For thousands of years we had hope, and we've arrived. And there's hope, I think, after October the 7th and October the 8th. There's been a groundswell of Jews in the United States in particular, and other diaspora communities kind of reconnecting and going back to our roots, to our culture, to our wisdom, and being strong. At the same time, there is a polarization. In New York City, you have a significant minority of young Jews that are going to vote for the anti-Semite Mamdani. And he has a good chance of winning, and he'll have a platform that's not just municipal or national. It will become an international platform of normalizing genocidal anti-Semitism in the guise of progressive God knows what. Canada, there's a few Montrealers in the room, at least 4. I'm amazed at how deeply entrenched the Muslim Brotherhood is in Canadian political and civic society. The community is living in fear of being labeled Islamophobic, racist. Insurance policies are being threatened from major Jewish organizations. The Lady Davis Foundation, family friends of my parents for many generations. It's a prominent fund that supports scholarship in Israel out of Montreal. They were told by the Bank of Montreal that they're no longer allowed to do banking with them, that they should look elsewhere. So there's the normalization, institutionalization of anti-Semitism is progressing. We need courage, we need hope. I don't know. I mean, so there is a movement towards hope and reconnecting, but I also think of scholars and the weakness, the profound weakness of scholars that gave an opening to this genocidal anti-Semitism. Even after October the 7th, professors at Columbia University saying to me, who are pro-Israel, fighting anti-Semitism, that, I don't agree with Rashid Khalili or Joseph Mossad, but they're colleagues, and there's academic freedom, and they have a right. Jewish scholars at Columbia University living in fear 10 years ago, 20 years ago, to speak about anti-Semitism, to speak about Judaism. I had a seminar series at the law school, ISGAP had a seminar series at the law school, and I remember my colleague Haris Rafiq, who was, a proud Muslim from the UK fighting radical Islam and anti-Semitism and human decency, and at great risk, physical risk to him and his family, and professors pulling Harris and I aside at Columbia University with tenure in the Upper West Side of the biggest Jewish community, saying, can you remove this word from your title? And can you please not speak, you remember this, Larry? Yes. Don't speak about certain things because you're going to embarrass us, cause a problem. So scholars have historically, and I think continue to be quite weak in general, and have been at the forefront of this normalization of genocidal anti-Semitism. We've been saying from the classroom to the encampment to the streets to to society. So on the one hand, there's kind of a split. People are stepping up and it's amazing. On the other hand, there's a serious problem within our community of, if it's assimilation, it's opportunism, it's not the inability to fight the fight. So how do we move forward as a community?
So, I'm going to stand up again. I'm a pacer when I speak. So. I'll say something about academia.
Neurologically, it's good.
It is. I'll say something about academia, about universities. I've said this to university presidents, including the 3 that were in Congress from that hearing that I met with before the hearing. Look, universities are what was exposed in the responses to October the 7th on universities, right? Professors exhilarated by October the 7th, or Khalil, a graduate of Columbia, I think just yesterday, explaining that October the 7th was inevitable. The understanding that what was exposed was a moment of reckoning for academic spaces, from my perspective. In any space that was unable to unequivocally condemn the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity of October the 7th, without a but at the end of the sentence, what was exposed was the collapse of morality. That's not about us. The collapse of morality. But when it happened in academic spaces in the name of academic freedom, free speech, you needed very little to be able to expose the double standard. And as I said, I believe in single standard. I'm a single standard girl. Double standards basically collapse the standard. And so to those 3 presidents, for example, when I briefed the Education Committee the day after they were in Congress, I said, the one question I was missing was, can you call for the genocide of any other group on your campus without violating your code of conduct? To which the answer is no. Because according to all of the DEI infrastructure and policies, including university spaces, you can't even misgender somebody without violating the code of conduct. You certainly can't call for the genocide of anyone without violating the code of conduct. Now, the more that we can actually use existing policies, whatever they may be, and we can talk about DEI and what E stands for, and I actually think that E is almost, or not almost, is systemically anti-Semitic, because equity actually is neo-Marxism. That's what it means. So there's a lot to talk about that E. But so long as it exists, if there's a policy that protects everyone, except for David, who happens to be a Jew, Sally, who happens to be a Zionist, and Fred, who believes Israel has a right to exist, that policy is not worth the paper it's written on. The students that were allowed to bar their peers from access to a library, to a class, to their dorm room, in encampments that literally violate policies, or at U of T, you may know this, but after they reseeded their lawn that was completely demolished by the encampment, I happened to be in Toronto one Friday and went to this protest where outside of the president's office with megaphones and speakers that are not allowed, there were screams of from the river to the sea, and we don't want no Jew state, we want all the 48, with the president not applying U of T policies, simple policies, administrative, if you will,
Jewish
policies, of course. The understanding that in many, many ways what was exposed, and for me it matters not if the individual is a Jew or not, it's very important for me to say. I don't necessarily think that the fact that I spoke to many Jewish presidents or Jewish professors, or that somebody says to me, oh, well, we have this Israeli self-identified genocide scholar who actually says, oh, this definition of genocide works just fine. Remove intent, and yes, Israel's perpetrating genocide. The as a Jew Jews, as I call them, or as a anti-Zionist Jew, Peter Beinart, okay? For me, that's not anything new either. We have been for thousands of years witness, there are those that will say only a fraction of us left Egypt for this reason. We have been witness to those of us that actually believe that if we just shed the relevant loathed pound of flesh, we could be good human beings. If we just convert, we could be good human beings. If we just shed the relevant loathed pound of flesh in the way that anti-Semitism mutates religion, science, well, science you couldn't shed, right? That was the Nazis' point. You can't shed 3 generations can't shed that blood. That inferior race thing couldn't be shed. And I will claim neither can Zionists be shed from Jewish identity without denying what we are as a people, which is precisely what our enemies understood very well. And though some of us are willing to shed that Zionist pound of flesh, to me it's not an indication that we have lost any war. It's the opposite. It's what actually enables, from my perspective, at least in 2025, in a reality where everybody gets to self-identify as whatever they may choose. But I don't. And I am a Zionist. I cannot just shed my Zionist pound of flesh to be a good human being. That, for me, is one of the most important responses. And making it very clear, this is not a Jewish issue. It's not an Israel issue. It's a moment of reckoning for academic spaces. Are they seriously places that teach people how to think, as I said, what I went to law school for? Or are they places that are teaching people what to think, a very dangerous prospect that echoes very dark chapters in history? And you are at the intersection where I will say, I think what was exposed post-October 7th is that this decades-long war that had, yes, hijacked and weaponized international institutions and the law, the UN, we mentioned many of the institutions, hijacked and weaponized academia with what you've exposed, including all of that foreign funding that has been poured in without transparency. But we have the tools to understand what we need to do. If billions of dollars have been poured in without transparency, what we need is transparency. And I will say the sort of third battlefront where this is raging that's being exposed, one that I delved into a little bit as legislator, we live in a social media era. We would be remiss if we don't understand the digital platform impact and lack of transparency. And you mentioned the word polarizing, so the understanding that the business model, it's the business model of social media platforms. It's how they keep eyeballs. It's how they get engagement, polarizing and fragmentizing. That is the business model. One of my counterparts in the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism, primarily the Americans, would say to me, but it's free speech. I said, it's not free speech. It's very expensive speech. Somebody's making tons of money. This is not free speech. This is not us walking through Hyde Park and choosing who we're going to listen to standing on the soapbox. If it is, show me the algorithm. Show me the algorithm. Forget the money. Show me the algorithm. And I will never know what the algorithm is because the whole point of the business model is precisely that. It targets me for either what I want to hear to keep me there or what I really, really hate to keep me there. That's how it works, fragmentizing and polarizing. Now, when you think about what it is that threatens the foundations of democracies, terror and tyranny that have openly declared war on the foundations of those democracies and are intent to collapse them, you think precisely what terror does. What does terror do? It disseminates fear. I won't speak up, I'm afraid to speak up, even if I speak, right? Disseminates distrust. Precisely what democracies need and our social covenant, and by the way, what countries and what individuals need in the relationship between us, trust. And it disseminates despair. Despair, hopelessness, the understanding that the people of Iran have been left on their own to fight this tyrannical regime is one we have to make clear because it becomes not a Jewish issue, and therefore, and I'll say one more thing about anti-Semitism, just to you know, everybody always asks me, oh, you're such an expert in anti-Semitism, how come it exists? And I've had a lot of time on airplanes to think about it. So I always understand, and we later on Isaac talks about otherness, right? The Jew always looked like the other. The state of Israel, by the way, if you zoom out, Ruth Reese says, if you have a map of Israel without a map of the entire Middle East in your office, you're not getting the issue. Israel in the Middle East is the other, for sure. And I accept that understanding of the other. But in the last 22 months, I'll say 2 more things in response to a question that I realized that makes anti-Semitism the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference. And those 2 other things are memory, zachor. We know that that word appears more in the Bible that was so badly desecrated on October 7th than any other word, memory. If we are the bearers of memory of history, and there's only less than 16 million of us because we haven't recovered from the Holocaust, the easiest thing you need to do to make sure nobody recognizes what you're doing in a tyranny, terror, war, barbarism, and civilization is just murder memory. If nobody has memory, the bearers of memory no longer remember, or they're not there, and maybe some of them have forgotten, then you can't identify the recurrence of history in rhyme, memory. And the second piece of that I think is critical that we understand is hope. Hope, for me, I don't just mention hope again and again, not just as our national anthem. Hope that carried the Jewish people through thousands of years of Jewish history, and that we carry through thousands of years of Jewish history. You know, it's another anecdote, I'm sorry. Do we have just 5 minutes left? 2 minutes, 1 minute. We're gonna hope.
We have a lot of questions.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. So I'll just end with this. I'll end this question with this. You know, I was invited as special envoy for combating anti-Semitism to march a living with university professors and presidents in the Yom HaShoah just after October the 7th. And as we marched from this small town in Poland to where the entire community not only dug up its own pit that it was shot into, but the musicians in the town were actually demanded to play Hatikva as the entire village was shot into this pit, and of course they were shot at the end. And it occurred to me that what the Nazis knew they needed to murder in order for barbarism to take over civilization is to murder hope. It's not that hard when there's only 16 million of us. The intent to annihilate the state of Israel, it's not personal. I don't take it personally. It's actually very smart. If you murder memory and hope in your attempt, this radical jihadi regimes of our day, to be able to build an alternate reality on the rubble of civilization, you just need murder, memory, and hope. It's very simple. And that is actually, for me, the reminder of why it's not just an issue for Jewish professors, students, or Jews at all. I hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have a lot of questions, so very brief and quick too. So Larry, a brief question and
Yes, well, thank you. And how could I not agree with everything that you said, and you say with such power that I actually can contagiously get some hope after being beaten down by everything that's going on. In the last several months, I'm at Columbia, I'm on the campus at Columbia, and in the last 6 months, and I'm not questioning Israel policy or anything like that, but the front and center thing, of course, has been the death in Gaza. And to be honest, I have not found a way, so that in front of all these arguments, that comes first, and that shuts down everything. So the question is, how do we respond to that? How do you talk about it and help us?
Thank you.
Larry, I think that, second question.
We'll try to incorporate everybody. Maybe a brief question, please.
Your whole presentation was about the inversion of reality, and you said that they hate us because they know we're good. Do you suppose that that's also the reason that they use international human rights law? Not because they value it, but because they know it's good. That is to say, they're against all that is good.
So I'll start with the second, and I'll just say it precisely makes the point, right? International law, the laws of war, human rights, it's not just that it's all that is good, it's the social covenant that was created post-World War II. And in many ways, and by the way, it doesn't mean that we are just good. We're just as, sort of imperfect as all others. The thing with double standards is that if you apply those principles selectively, or as John Spencer, a military war expert, continues to write about in terms of the laws of war, in invented standards, right? And you've actually not just redefined and inverted, as you say, in this Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, then you collapse the entire infrastructure. So it's like that's why I say anti-Semitism is both tool and symptom. It's not random that anti-Semitism always appears in the attack of civilization or the world's the rules-based order. And to maybe then pivot into Larry's question, I'll say the following: it doesn't mean at all to say ever that there's no tragedy in Gaza. None of this means there's no tragedy in Gaza. The question remains: who is responsible for the tragedy in Gaza? right? Hamas is a genocidal terror organization for whom human tragedy is the strategy, that not only has used its own children, intentionally embedding in and between and below hospitals, mosques, schools, homes, we all know this, but benefits from the accusations of the tragedy in Gaza. Now, that's akin to saying there must have been some human suffering of unnecessary civilians, innocent civilians, when the Allies finally decided that Hitler and the Nazi regime had to be fought. When we don't understand that it's the same kind of war that Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, and the genocidal Islamic regime in Iran, of which anti-Semitism is both tool and symptom, actually openly declares the intent to build an alternate reality on the rubble of our shared civilization, then we go back to Churchill in his statement to Chamberlain. You had the choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor and you will have war. That's true at Columbia. That's true in the international institutions. It's true in Canada. It's true in the United States. It's true right here in the UK. And the understanding that the universities are now serving as peddlers of this disinformation that enable to attack civilization in this way. Again, we've been here before. It's not going to be the first time, right? The Freie Universität of Berlin, I believe that's how it was born. The understanding that they're peddling in a social media era, what we see on legacy media, we would be remiss if we didn't, for 1 minute pause on the devastation that legacy media is mirroring social media. It's not only thrown away ethical guidelines, proper journalism, whether it's 11 days after, imagine 11 days after 9/11 on the front page of the New York Times. I actually asked this at the New York Times. 11 days after 9/11, would you, with evidence given you by Al-Qaeda, publish on the front page of the New York Times what it was that they did publish 11 days after 10/7? And that is the accusation by Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, that Israel had bombed a hospital. Of course, turns out it was an errant rocket from Palestinian Islamic Jihad that, was misfired and hit a parking lot. But also just days ago, with a little boy who suffers from a terrible genetic disease on the front page of the New York Times as proof for starvation. If universities, if schools of journalism are not doing a case study on the failure of journalism, of legacy media, as watchdog of democracy. Again, I'll go back to that over and over again. It's not about us, forget us. As watchdog of democracy, if journalism has become watchdog of terror, by the way, once again, with ISGAP's research Qatar and Al Jazeera and the other sources that we know are very well funded, then what is the watchdog of democracy? It hasn't just gone to sleep. It's moved to the other side. And that is something that, again and again, I know it's not easy in those spaces because you become this soul warrior, and it's war.
We have a bunch more questions.
I'm sorry, I'm too long.
Today in the New York Times, the headline is, many Jewish voters back Mamdani and many agree with him on Gaza. New York Times.
Hi, thank you for a very informative talk. It's much appreciated. I teach at Boston University. I've been the chair of the Task Force on Anti-Semitism, and I'm in very close contact with the administration about what to do to make our campus more peaceful. We had no encampments. We had no violent protests. So we've been, I think, doing a pretty good job. But here's the question I had, and I've posed to the administration. How do you codify the differences between free speech and hate speech when they don't understand what from the river to the sea really means, the original Arabic, which is from the river to the sea, or from the river to the river, it shall be all Arab. How do you codify that in a legal sense or in any kind of sense so that the students can become better informed on what they're actually saying, which of course is a huge problem.
So I'll just on Mamdani, and when I speak about Mamdani, I just want to say, Mamdani is not just a problem for Jews or Israel. In case anybody didn't understand, it's literally a problem for New York and for the United States of America, right? Mamdani hates everything that New York represents, that freedom and democracy is supposed to represent. So once again, it's just the front lines of what's being exposed. But it's not about us. And it's not just Jewish New Yorkers that we should care about the support for Mamdani. It's actually New Yorkers that need to understand that neo-Marxism that wants to cancel the police and actually speaks about not just the legitimacy of October the 7th as the massacre and the justification of the terror that took place there. That's not just a problem for Jews. And I think that our challenge is to make that across spaces and places of difference, to reach, transcend, and reach across real or perceived difference of politics, of religion, of denomination, of geography, including in New York. And to answer that question about Boston University, look, the IRA becomes the most important resource we have for a reason. And about its operationalization, if you will, the Canadian government, you know, my counterpart in Canada, Deborah Lyons, published something very useful. It's on the federal government's homepage, which I can send to Charles, he can share with you. It's a handbook on the operationalization of IRA. It explains very clearly the 11 examples of IRA so that when people say, I don't understand, it's so confusing. Although, if it was anti-black racism or any other kind of racism, we would understand very well why it's not okay. So long as you identify all strains of anti-Semitism using IRA, then you understand pretty easily why from the river to the sea, the call to annihilation of the state of Israel, even if you don't know the map, which is why I started wearing this, from the river to the sea is the entire thing. So you can't say from the river to the sea and I believe in the two-state solution. You literally can't say the two, it's an oxymoron. So the understanding that I think universities too have this resource, it is called IRA, and it's not just about the implementation of their other policies that would have prevented, as you did, encampments and harassment and intimidation, which another thing I want to say about American presidents that I've had the conversation with, it's not speech, it's conduct. Meaning there's literally violence and vandalism that have occurred at all of these campuses in the name of free speech. I really fail to recognize what it is that needs to be more concrete than not just the prevention of equal access to education and Title VI and so on. What we saw throughout those protests and encampments is violence, it's intimidation, it's bullying, it's harassment, it's vandalism. It sent university employees to hospitals after they were attacked. And so in that sense, I think that the clarity with which we speak has to be refined, and this sort of two-sidesing or false moral equivalency that we keep allowing to be in our midst, right? Anti-Semitism and all other forms of hate. Of course I'm committed to combating all forms of hate, but have all forms of hate actually been a tsunami on any of the other campuses other than anti-Semitism? Have we seen any mosques, any Muslim or Christian schools need 24-hour security guards? Have we seen former public officials other than Jews, or current public officials other than Jews, need 24-hour police protection, including when they go to the hospital in Canada? The answer is no. And so very often when we try to level the playing field and create this false moral equivalence, instead of just saying, I'm committed to combating anti-Semitism. This is the definition of anti-Semitism. That is what's ailing this campus. And of course, all other forms of hate, but we wouldn't ask about any other forms of hate. How do we recognize it? The group that is targeted would say to us, what do you mean? What do you mean? I get to define the hate that is targeting me. I, as a Zionist, whether I'm a Jew or not, get to define the hate that is targeting me. And again, double standards that work in all kinds of ways has exposed that too.
So there's about 15 minutes left because we have a hard stop, so 2 quick questions here.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your work. I'd like to present some limitations to yours and others' classification of anti-Semitism as a disease or a virus that mutates, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. So when classifying anti-Semitism as a virus or as a disease, 1, it implies that the perpetrator of anti-Semitism is a victim of a disease rather than the Jews being the recipient of it. 2, it negates individual responsibility of behaving in anti-Semitic ways and allows people to plead criminal insanity when committing anti-Semitic acts. 3, it implies that there is a cure, which there is little evidence of, especially given the failures of Holocaust educators, stated mission on combating anti-Semitism, and the rampant Holocaust denial that exists among younger generations. 4, it puts the responsibility of curing anti-Semitism on others, which again removes attention from the perpetrators of anti-Semitism, and it's also resulted in Jewish organizations spending untold amounts of money trying to cure anti-Semitism. So I'm curious how you'd respond to that. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you for all of those points. They're very important. Look, anti-Semitism is not a problem of Jews, in case it wasn't clear from what I said. It's a problem of anti-Semites, as, by the way, with all other forms of hate. We would never say anti-black racism is a problem of blacks, right? And, pardon me? Yeah, so it's a problem of anti-Semites and of the places, spaces, and individuals that peddle this hate, right? That's the problem. That's what we have to cure, if you will. Now, the reason that I use a virus as the example is that it does mutate over thousands of years. And I think the importance of understanding that a virus that mutates needs to be identified holistically, comprehensively, if you will, if we are really committed to combating it, is much more useful than perhaps some of the challenges that you've presented. I don't know of any other way to explain to an individual that doesn't understand anti-Semitism as this ever-mutating virus why we would require 11 examples in the IRA. By the way, it's a working definition. I always try and make this accessible. It's a working definition. I'm going to say this with devastation, because in about 50 years or 100 years, we're going to have to add example number 12. So understanding it as an ever-mutating virus, and I actually refrain from saying a cancer or I do say an ever-mutating virus, because we need to be able to understand the thousands of years of this hate, and we can call it glass as far as I'm concerned, but it has a definition. And that IRA working definition intentionally enables us and spells out the 11 variations or variants or shapes of this shape-shifting, ever-mutating virus, okay? Now, you asked one thing that I did want to touch upon, and now I forgot what it was in my train of thought about the IRA, about the working definition. Maybe one of the first, will you repeat the first sort of concerns you have about describing it as a virus?
No individual responsibility.
Oh, thank you. Not only is it about individual responsibility, when we understand it in that way, is you can choose to contract a virus. You have agency. I believe in human agency. If you know that something is sick, and for example, a cult, okay, or I don't know, a dangerous drug, I believe in human agency for everybody. And with agency comes personal responsibility. What I believe this intersects with in a very big way, and that's a much deeper conversation we can have, is actually what's ailing democracies generally, that has divided the world between oppressed, oppressor, victim, victimizer. By the way, that means that a forever refugee status absolves you of personal agency. That's what we've seen, right? Victimizer, oppressor is what we got to be, except that in the intersection with this, the absolving of the individual, if you will, or the removal of agency has actually absolved of personal responsibility. That's not what I think at all. I think exactly the opposite. I think that contracting anti-Semitism, if you will, as that ever-mutating virus, demands personal agency of knowledge. I think that the inoculation to being contaminated or infected with this ever-mutating virus demands the individual to actually learn to think critically, to actually engage in knowledge that challenges them. And what we've seen is exactly the opposite. We've seen ignorance, in the words of George Eliot at the time, I forget the exact quote and I don't want to maul it, but about the knowledge is power. She, by the way, George Eliot was a woman. She used a man's pen name because she thought she'd be taken more seriously. So George Eliot writes about, everyone saying that knowledge is power, but who has the thought of the power of ignorance, pulling down in an hour what generations of knowledge has built up? So the personal agency and responsibility is not my intent at all in describing what is, from my perspective, a shape-shifting phenomenon that has outlasted many, many empires that have risen and fallen, but has actually has been carried in many ways with Jews as their existence. That's not to say that we are responsible for its existence, or that the state of Israel, as some will say today, if just is, by the way, a professor actually said this to me, I don't know if Batsheva was there, maybe she was, that if Israel didn't exist, then anti-Semitism wouldn't exist. You were there, Professor Zimmerman. Why does anti-Semitism exist today, you ask me? Because Israel exists. Now that, if you're referring to that, is unacceptable. but the understanding that what it demands is actually to reclaim agency and responsibility and shift the responsibility not on the existence of the Jew, or in this case, the Jew among nations, but to those peddling the virus and spreading the virus, for me, remains our biggest challenge. Yeah.
Michal, thank you so much again. Lovely to see you again. There's two parts to my question. The first is directed at you as an Israeli official. So on the one hand, I guess my question is there an understanding from, and I know it's a very fractious time in Israeli politics, but an understanding that the front of the war that we are fighting in the diaspora of this asymmetric warfare should be prioritized almost at the top at this point? And secondly, and how is that received internally in Israel? And I think the second question, is there an understanding that perhaps some of the strategies, the messaging of the Israeli establishment does not help in the fighting of that war in any way, shape and form? Because there seems from the outside to be a perspective from even a lot of the Israeli speakers that we've seen come here that, well, you know, you can't deal with the liberal establishment, that they're already ideologically captured, that they have no idea what they're doing, that they're insane. Whereas someone who's on the front lines, who deals with liberal policymakers, I wouldn't say that. And there are many people who maybe are quiet, but will still listen and need the liberal fundamentals to be able to have that conversation.
I'll actually start at the end of your question and say, oh.
Please take notes.
Oh, no. Oh, okay.
Please take notes, because I want to try to incorporate a few other.
Oh, a few.
Take a couple.
My question is just, as a lawyer yourself, do you see any legal tools that could be used on the university campus pertaining to the dissemination of lies in the classroom? That's my question.
Hang on, Harriet.
Thank you. This is a strategic question. When university presidents are not listening, how do we exert control? I mean, we saw that with Columbia and the Trump administration. And applying that metaphor to international organizations and the legacy media, how do we exert control?
A very brief question. Min al-maya lil-maya, from the water to the water. As you said, it is one state solution, which is Palestinian, rather than a two-state solution. On the other hand, when we fight anti-Semitism, we do not allow people to say that they believe in a two-state solution. So, for example, there are many people now who say, the question is, are we not allowing them any, we are helping them, min al-maya lil-maya, people from the river to the sea, by saying that no person should allow a Palestinian state, etc. We don't give any solution in the sense that we are blocking.
Oh my God. No, two more comments, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you for your presentation. Following your example of the virus, when COVID first came, even the epidemiologists and the toxicologists underestimated that it was airborne. So I agree with you, a human agency. But we have people that are infected by the virus because it's airborne, and they don't even know they have the virus.
I'll do it privately.
Yeah, privately?
Okay.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay. I'm going to try and work in the order that does Israel recognize the eighth front of war? So I started by actually professing that I'm a volunteer in my role, which tells you basically all you need to know. And I'll actually then say a big part of why I'm doing this, recognizing that this eighth front of war, which as a member of the Foreign Relations and Security Committee in Israel's 23rd Knesset, using actually the case and cause of Hadar Goldin, a deceased soldier that remains in captivity, remains in captivity in standing violation of law and morality for now 11 years. Another manifestation of what we're talking about today, by the way, the hijacking, weaponization of international law, the understanding that Israel still, and then I had argued that this eighth front of war, as I've called it, will ultimately dictate Israel's ability to fight on all of the fronts. It is dictating Israel's ability to fight on all other fronts. It's the reason for me that was my Tzavshmona, if you will. That was my, when everybody was called up to task, it's the reason I got on the first plane from Argezian's Shiva, was knowing that this eighth front was going to rage. Nothing surprised me by what we saw. But that's a very long answer, and I don't excuse it. I work very hard to try and make a change in that. But Israel still, I would say, generally does not recognize that it's this eighth front. And I will say, Jews around the world do not recognize that the 7 fronts of war that endanger existentially the state of Israel do not realize that it's one war. That if in the past, maybe even I would have said we are 2 sides of the same coin, October the 7th and what we've exposed since is that we are one side of the same coin. This is one war. It has many fronts. This 8th front is a critical one. It has to be understood as such. It requires a comprehensive strategy that, by the way, answers some of the questions that were asked you, including when we are combating together with allies around the world, understanding everything we understand about international law and institutions and the university spaces and legacy media and social media and the streets. It requires a comprehensive strategy. You don't fight a war. Even the word Hasbara, okay? I never use it. I actually hate it. Why? Hasbara actually is symptomatic of precisely what the Jewish nation state still has not understood in a Dreyfus kind of way that requires that we rise from the dock of the accused, okay? And if the state of Israel is the Jew among nations with equal membership and the ability, and I'm going to say the responsibility, to demand the equal and consistent application of the international rules-based order to it as an equal member, allegedly equal member state of the family of nations. Rising from the dock of the accused actually would change the term Hasbara to have what every other country has, public diplomacy. Hasbara insinuates, somebody told me that the Queen of England used to say, don't complain, don't explain. Hasbara actually insinuates you've done something wrong. Dreyfus, seated on the dock of the accused, responding to the allegations, the accusations, explaining what you've done, and that is the way that we perceive what the state of Israel has to do, and what we have to do as defenders, if you will, of the state of Israel, and believers in her right to exist, to explain ourselves ad nauseum to the accusations. This is a war. You don't win a war by explaining to Iran why it should annihilate us. It's not what we do. Israel, and until we recognize this 8th front as the critical piece that it is, does not yet have a comprehensive strategy. I've spoken about it with Charles many times, a comprehensive strategy that includes the legal elements, access to information elements, the many elements that have gone into the 50 years of systematic demonization, delegitimization, application of double standards. It's a very long answer to say we're not there yet, but on this 8th front, Israel will not be able to fight alone, and it won't be able to win alone. What I've just described and what ISGAP is very importantly doing is exposing not just the billions that have actually gone into this systematic demonization, delegitimization, application of double standards that has resulted in the tsunami of anti-Semitism and in the collapse of democratic spaces, but actually and expose the systematic nature of it, and that actually even goes to the airborne piece of the virus, right? You don't know what you don't know. That's 100% true. And if what you know is Zionism's racism, Israel's an apartheid state that commits genocide and murders babies and so on and so on and so on, then we're going to have to create a comprehensive strategy that recognizes this is a war front and that fights it as a war. And that is precisely my intent, in whatever capacity, by the way, I feel. That is precisely my intent, and to connect the dots in the many ways that we have to. I touched on some of the other questions, I think, here. So in addition to the legal tools, who asked for the legal tools? The legal tools are very important because, remind me, who asked for the legal tools? Oh, yes. The legal tools have been used in this war, right? I said the law has been weaponized. The law has been inverted and used in this war to systematically demonize, delegitimize, apply double standards to the Jew among nations, that is the state of Israel. By the way, just as it was used against Dreyfus, as, I don't know if you noticed, doesn't matter, I can speak, I can shout. Is this okay? I don't know if you know, but just recently France announced that it was raising Dreyfus's rank back. Actually, it was raising his rank. and taking back what had happened to Dreyfus. I mean, in this Orwellian inverted reality, while the same President Macron told us that we should thank the UN and France for recognizing the state of Israel, to which I say, Israel doesn't exist as a reparation prize for the murder of 6 million Jews. Is that what you thought it was? It's not a reparation prize. That's not what the state of Israel is. But legal tools have rendered precisely what most people will say the state of Israel is. So a 77-year-old young reparation prize for the murder of 6 million Jews. Israel, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, is the nation state of prototypical indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution committed to equality. Except that legal tools were used to render that.
That's what Obama said in Cairo.
Absolutely, it's what Obama said in Cairo. Absolutely, and it's what the State Department and my counterpart in the United States very often had arguments with me about Deborah Lipstadt. She no longer is a special officer for combating anti-Semitism in the understanding of what the state of Israel is. By the way, that's true for American Jews as well, what the state of Israel is. The dissemination of lies. Look, the dissemination of lies have to be held to account. At the end of the day, that doesn't mean I have to go, okay. So I'll just say, across the board, we would not stand for the dissemination of lies, not by universities, not by media, not anywhere, if it was personal. It's personal. We have to begin to see it as personal, and actually suing or using the law is available to us in the democracies that we inhabit as a mechanism that says you're going to be held to account for publishing on the front page of the New York Times peddling blood libel that makes its way around the world before the truth straps its boots on and fuels anti-Semitic attack around the world. We're going to have to go to bat for the dissemination of lies. And finally, one last thing I did want to say about the two-state, one-state, blah, blah, blah. I spoke about, I can't remember if it was here or in the other group, I'm sorry. But alongside Zionism's racism, I mentioned the 3 No's of Khartoum. Did I mention it here? I didn't. Oh. So, and I can send you an article that I wrote, or Charles can send it. I called it the war on the Abraham Accords. Look, alongside Zionism's racism in 1975, just before actually the Arab League passed what's known as the 3 No's of Khartoum: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace with Israel. What the Abraham Accords actually enabled, potentially, if we realize the potential, was the inversion, or the pivot, if you will, historically from the 3 No's to yeses, 3 yeses to recognition, that enables negotiation, that paves the path to peace. It's actually the opposite model of what Israel has been told for decades, that says the following: make peace, then we'll negotiate the terms of the peace, then we'll see if they recognize your right to exist. In what reality would any individual agree to such an arrangement? None. In fact, with the Abraham Accords, and that's precisely why the Islamic Republic of Iran would do everything, including the current war, to actually turn back the clock on the potential paradigmal shift inherent to the Abraham Accords that would render shelves and shelves of books called the Arab-Israeli conflict irrelevant. The Abraham Accords were the potential to shift the entire region. You think Iran didn't recognize that? And that includes the pivot or the paradigmal shift with the Palestinians. What it requires is recognition of each other's right to exist as who we are. In Israel's case, the nation state of the Jewish people. They returned after millennia of exile and persecution, by the way, prototypical indigenous people, not a reparation prize, as Mahmoud Abbas too says regularly at the UN, wearing his key, wanting to return to Akko and Lod and Tel Aviv. And if you don't think he wants Judea and Samaria, you're wrong. We're not there properly. That wasn't what this was about, and that's a whole other longer conversation. But the potential pivot that says recognition of Israel, of what it was founded to be as the nation state of the Jewish people, that enables negotiation, that paves the path to peace. That's true for all peoples of the region and beyond, including the Palestinians. For me, that is the most important walkaway. So when you say now, I recognize Palestine in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, without saying the Palestinian Authority, I just mentioned Mahmoud Abbas, I think in his 20th year or 4-year term, Canada, thank you very much. They'll have elections, but without Hamas in a democracy, you're going to tell them who to vote. 74% actually support Hamas and the October 7th massacre. Okay, there's a lot to talk about there. But if you do not actually predicate whatever it is that will look like in the future on the pivot or on the paradigm shift that was inherent to the Abraham Accords that says, yeah, first you recognize Israel's right to exist. Then we can negotiate the terms of coexistence, and ultimately that can pave the path to peace that we have gone back and not forwards. I'm going to end here. Thank you, everybody. I think my time is out. And I'm available for any follow-up questions, if not here, then, in future engagements. And thank you to ISGAP for all the important work that you do, Charles.
Thank you for all the important work you do and your voice. And yeah, very important. So thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Enjoy your lunch, everybody.